Well, as Amanda said, my talk is called The Genius of a Wilde Family. It pretty much covers the whole of the 19th century because Sir William Wilde was born in 1815 and Oscar Wilde died in 1900. And of course, there is the pun on Wilde. I forgot to say that. The genius of a Wilde family. However, I want to begin by adding a third element to my talk, which explains why it took 100 years for all the Wildes to regain the stature they once had and merited. This is the terrible tragedy that befell Oscar Wilde in 1895 and destroyed the reputation of the whole family. Just going to put gallery here. Okay. In 1885, Henry Labouchere, the editor of a magazine called Truth, very ironic, and very, very homophobic, tacked on the Labouchere Amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Act. It made gross indecency a crime in the UK. In practice, the law was used very broadly, emphasis on very, to prosecute male homosexuals where actual sodomy, which had been illegal since 1533, that's Henry VIII's day, could not be proved. There was no precise description of gross indecency because the Victorians were too hypocritically prudish to stoop to using the vocabulary it required. Thus, it was left up to the courts to determine the nature and the extent of the so-called crime. This has bearing on Oscar Wilde's punishment, which was extremely harsh and in no way commensurate with his so-called crime. So what was his crime, you may ask? His crime was the affair he had with Bosie. Now we're in the last decade of the 19th century. In 1892, Oscar Wilde began an affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, or Bosie, meaning little boy, as he was nicknamed by his mother. He was the third son of the Marquis of Queensberry, who had two older boys, Francis and Percy. Bosie at the time was 22, Wilde was 38. Now this relationship absolutely incensed Bosie's homophobic father, the Marquis of Queensberry, and he stalked Wilde and Bosie throughout London in search of evidence, and on the 18th of February, 1895, left his card at Wilde's club with the words, "To Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." And I actually have a picture of this card here, which I'll just briefly put up there. You might be able to tell that he was illiterate, and also some people call him a boor, I call him a thug. Anyway, the date 18th of February has relevance. Wilde, as you may know, was at the height of his fame at this time. Lady Windermeres Fan was produced in 1892, and it made him the most sought after man in London for exclusive dinner parties. A Woman of No Importance appeared in 1893. An Ideal Husband opened January the 3rd, 1895, and The Importance of Being Earnest on February the 14th, 1895. That's Valentine's Day. Tom Stoppard calls this play, which you probably have seen, the most nearly perfect work in English stage comedy. The Marquis of Queensberry had been denied entrance to the opening night because he had threatened to make a public denunciation of Oscar Wilde and Bosie, and hence the calling card on the 18th of February, 4 days later. Now, in response to the calling card, Wilde sued Queensberry for libel. Now, Wilde himself was very non-aggressive, very passive, didn't like aggressive sports or anything like that. but he was encouraged by Bosie, who hated his father, to sue him, which Wilde went ahead and did sue him. The trial date was April the 3rd at the Old Bailey. Bosie had wanted to see his father, Queensberry, behind bars. However, at the trial, so much evidence had been compiled by Queensberry, who had paid some of the male prostitutes with whom Wilde and Bosie had associated to testify, that the prosecutor was forced to concede that Queensberry's charge of sodomy was justified. It wasn't justified at all, really. Edward Carson was Queensberry's defense lawyer and actually an old schoolmate of Wilde's. Very, very smart guy, and of course he won, but he is reported to have said that he had ruined the most brilliant man in Dublin. At that point, the evidence accumulated was then used by the director of the Crown Prosecution Service at Scotland Yard to sue Wilde for gross indecency. The second and third trials were held on April 22nd and April 26th and May 22nd. For the second trial, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous conclusion, but at the third trial, Wilde was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The consequences for Wilde were absolutely appalling. His name was taken down from the hoardings, and all his plays, well, the two wonderful plays that were up at the time, pulled. And even A Woman of No Importance, which was about to be staged in New York, was pulled. His books, like the fairy tales, The Picture of Dorian Gray, all his poems, were taken off the shelves of the bookstores. And the cost of his trial against Queensberry forced him into bankruptcy and a sale of all his personal possessions. And this was all his wonderful first editions that people had given him, all the art on his wall, the walls of his house on Tite Street, all his furniture. It was quite devastating, and all his letters. Queensberry had counterclaimed against Wilde for the cost of his lawyers and private detectives. Bosie had assured Wilde that Percy, Queensberry's second son, would pay the costs, but he did not. Now, the prison life for Wilde was inhuman. And if you've read Dickens, you will recognize all these prisons. He was taken to Newgate, then Holloway, then Pentonville, where he was kept in solitary confinement, had to sleep on a plank bed, and had to pick oakum, which is tarred rope that you have to pull apart and to fill the cracks in boats. No pipes or drain pipes were allowed in the cells, lest the prisoners communicate by tapping. So Wilde had a tin pot, which he had to empty himself. And, you know, the slops went everywhere. And so it must have been quite disgusting in his cell. A month later, he was transferred to Wandsworth Prison. And here he suffered the greatest humiliation, he said, of his life, when he had to stand on a platform in his prison clothes, and a crowd gathered and mocked him. And perhaps you know that in 2019, the LGBTQ community erected a plaque at the station in memory of the homophobic abuse Wilde had suffered. Also at Wandsworth, you know, prisoners were forced to go to chapel every day. He fell in the prison chapel and damaged his ear, and it never healed. And this is ultimately what caused his death, when an abscess in his ear drained into his brain instead of draining outwards. 5 months later, he was then transferred to Reading Jail, about which he wrote the famous ballad. And if I had time, I would read the Ballad of Reading Gaol to you, or we could all read it verse by verse because it's so famous and so wonderful. But another sad thing happened to Wilde at Reading. His mother died on February the 3rd, 1896. And when she asked from her deathbed whether her son could come and see her, her request was denied. And I think it said that she just turned her face to the wall and died. So Oscar Wilde was released a year later, May 20th, 1897. Why, you might ask, was the sentence so harsh? Well, Wilde's prison sentence was so harsh for at least two reasons. The first was out of envy. He had achieved great heights, and envious people encouraged and relished his fall. And the same thing happens today, of course. The second is that the Marquis of Queensberry's first son, Francis, had also been a homosexual and had carried on a secret affair with Lord Rosebery, who had hired him as his private secretary. The affair had begun in 1892 when Lord Rosebery was Gladstone's foreign secretary, and continued until 1894 when Lord Rosebery succeeded Gladstone as Prime Minister. Paradoxically, and perhaps you already know this, Rosebery was happily married to the richest woman in England, Hannah de Rothschild, who was Jewish, and they had 4 children. However, he also liked young men, and he was very, very fond of Francis Queensberry. Just as Queensberry was to stalk Bosie and Wilde in 1895, he stalked Lord Rosebery in search of evidence to destroy his relationship with his son. Fueled by his anti-Semitism and his homophobia, he wrote offensive letters to Lord Rosebery and to various people in power like Gladstone, threatening to reveal Lord Rosebery's secret life and also the secret life of other MPs in the magazine Truth. To save Lord Rosebery, Francis committed suicide in 1894. However, Queensberry's vindictiveness remained a threat, especially one assumes after the death of his first son. And when Wilde was tried for gross indecency the next year, the government's harsh punishment was driven by the fear that if Wilde were dealt with too leniently, Queensberry would revengefully make public the sexual secrets he knew about Lord Rosebery and the other MPs he'd done some research on. There was also a further devastating consequence from the verdict. When Oscar Wilde died in 1900, and that's only 3 years after he was released from prison, the floodgates of malice opened and destroyed for 100 years, as I said, the extraordinary legacy of the Wildes, the intellectual brilliance of the Wilde parents and Oscar, their amazing success intellectually and socially made them ready prey for the envious, and they mocked their wildness, their independence of thought, and their refusal to conform to arbitrary moral and social rules. In regard to what the Victorians considered virtues and sins, Wilde points out in his essay, The Critic as Artist, that what we consider virtues in one era can be rendered worthless in the next, as we discovered ourselves in 1967, when homosexuality was decriminalized, and in 2013, when Alan Turing, the genius who solved the Enigma code and shortened the war by about 2 years, and the father of the computer and artificial intelligence, was pardoned, and in 2017, when Wilde, one of our greatest literary geniuses, was pardoned under the Turing law. At the time, they died. Turing was 42 and Wilde was 46. And I mean, can you imagine what we lost by having the death of these geniuses so soon? Wilde once announced that he and his mother had decided to form a society for the suppression of virtue. What he meant, of course, was a suppression of the rules that destroyed anything that was different from the norm, thereby often stifling genius. And again, as you may know, on February the 14th, 1995, that's 100 years after The Importance of Being Earnest was staged, a stained glass window was installed in Westminster Abbey in honor of the great playwright. And now I want to give you brief sketches of the extraordinary parents of Oscar Wilde who were brought down with him, their genius and their wildness that made them extraordinary. Now we are in Ireland, Oscar Wilde's birthplace. Jane Francesca L.G. Wilde was Oscar Wilde's mother, and she said she was born in 1826, but in actual fact, she was born in 1821. She was a typical woman, you know, who denied her age. She signed her letters either as Speranza, her pen name as a journalist for the nationalist newspaper, The Nation, or as Lady Wilde, which she liked to be called after her husband was knighted in 1864. She was an unusual woman for her day. She was the voice of the Irish Revolution for legislative independence in 1848, an advocate for women's rights and women's education, and a poet, an essayist, and a loyal wife and mother. In his book, New Ireland, published in 1878, A.M. Sullivan describes her as beautiful, highly educated, and endowed with the rarest gifts of intellect. Her personal attractiveness, her cultivated mind, her originality and force of character made her a central figure in Dublin. She prized intellect or genius above all other abilities. When Oscar Wilde won the prestigious Newdigate Prize at Oxford in 1878 for his poem Ravenna, she wrote to him, "Oh, Gloria, Gloria, we have genius." Now, she's been mocked by biographers for the use of we, but it certainly was true. She herself was highly intelligent, and both she and her husband nurtured the intellect of all three of her children and encouraged them to excel academically, which you know that they did. There was Willie, her eldest son, Oscar Wilde, and then Isola, a daughter who died at the age of 10. Both she and her husband were also exemplary in their own lives. She married a man, indeed, whom some believe was a greater genius than her son Oscar. In fact, one of her essays is entitled Marriage with a Genius. There's little doubt in my mind that Sir William Wilde married a woman for her mind as well as for her looks. He had no sympathy for revolutions, but he loved Ireland, and she shared this love with him. When he died at the early age of 61, she finished off one of his books about the Irish countryside for him. She was very well educated, uncommon for a woman of her day. Her father, Charles L.G., was a Dublin solicitor, but he died when she was only 3 years old. However, her mother saw that she had tutors. She was also highly motivated to read extensively by herself and could converse with any of the schooled men of her day, like Sir William Rowan Hamilton, the magician and astronomer royal of Ireland, who was a good friend. Additionally, she taught herself as many as 10 languages, which served her well because she became an able translator. She translated poems from many different languages and books, like Sidonia the Sorceress by William Meinhold, and this was published by William Morris at the Kelmscott Press. That was from the German. Two works of the French author Alphonse de Lamartine and The Glacier Land by Alexander Dumas. The Irish worshipped her as a revolutionist, a role she undertook in her early 20s. She was very well read, as you can imagine, in the history of her country, and this made her not only patriotic, but keen on fostering a revolutionary spirit in the Irish. And you will think this is very pertinent for today. She wanted to unite the Catholics and the Protestants, the sympathetic landlords, the tenant farmers, and the peasants, to rise above their parochial concerns and in appreciation of their rich heritage. You may know that in 1800, the Act of Union was passed, so Ireland was governed from London, and political, economic, religious, and social inequities were rampant. Thus, in 1848, and you know there were revolutions all over Europe at that time, she and her fellow journalists led the charge for legislative independence. Of course, again, you probably know this, the revolution came in the midst of the terrible Irish famine, and it fizzled out when hunger stymied patriotism, much to Jane Elgey's despair and disillusionment. Her contribution to the nation consisted of a lot of poems. Her verse encouraged the revolution, and it's very rhythmical, stirring, and very rhymed. And she wrote verse depicting the famine, and these verses are very anti-British and very striking. And Kingsley Amis, who bemoaned the loss of meter and rhyme in contemporary verse, would just have loved her poetry. Such a strong beat to every line, wonderful rhymes. Her verse was read avidly, not only by the native Irish in Ireland at the time, but also those who had emigrated to America. And when Oscar Wilde went on a lecture tour to the US in 1882, the Irish over there knew her much better than her son and wanted to hear only about Jane Elgey and not her son, Oscar Wilde. And her poems were published in book form in 1864 and 1870. She also wrote many essays, which, like her poems, were published and eventually collected in books. She began writing them after the birth of her children because she had found that paradoxically, writing verse was too time-consuming. And also, she wrote a lot after her husband died in 1876, when she needed to augment her small income. She wrote essays on poets, writers, both male and female, playwrights, actors, political figures, and the status of women. And two of her essays in this regard are called The Bondage of Women Through the Ages and American Women. I suppose she saw American women as less bonded. The essays are all very insightful, and I have to confess that sometimes when I'm giving an opinion, I'm actually voicing her view. When she married, she held popular salons. The Wildes' high status in Dublin society and the fact that Sir William Wilde brought in a considerable income from private surgical patients allowed Lady Wilde to hold Saturday salons in their capacious house in 1 Merrion Square. If you've been to Dublin, you may have seen their house. It's this house here. It's in a wonderful Georgian square. She had read everything. People jostled to come to her salons. and she had read everything that these people had written, and therefore she was the consummate hostess. Her boys, Oscar and Willie, benefited from these intellectual assemblies and were also allowed to sit at the dining table when their parents were entertaining, which they did often. They loved to entertain. Both of them were remarkable conversationalists and ready wits. And you can see the connection there to Oscar Wilde. When Sir William died prematurely, Lady Wilde moved to London in 1879. Sadly for her, he left his family in considerable debt. He had been living, he suffered from cancer, and his last years he was living off capital and had mortgaged his considerable property to pay for his debts. In London, she tried courageously to sustain the role that she had played in Dublin, and indeed, people still flocked to her salons, including writers like Yeats and Shaw and early suffragettes. But her living quarters, and I've been to each one, became increasingly impoverished, and her fine Dublin clothes tawdry with use. And for this, she was mocked by spiteful people, especially women. Oscar Wilde's death in 1900 gave license to biographers to turn caricature into fact. She was buried in a pauper's grave in 1896 in Kensal Green Cemetery. But a monument in the form of a Celtic cross was erected in her honor in 1999. So that's a year, 100 years later. And on February the 3rd, 1996, 100 years after her death, the city of Dublin arranged a ceremonial funeral for her, and a plaque was added to the last empty panel on the family grave in Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin, displaying the many strengths that I've just listed. And now again, I just want to do a brief synopsis of Sir William Wilde. Undoubtedly a genius with a Renaissance mind. Many argue, as I said, he was a greater genius than Oscar. He died in 1876, and just at the age of 61, before Oscar's winning of the Newdigate Prize at Oxford, before Oscar's doubles first at Oxford, and of course, and perhaps a good thing, before all of Oscar Wilde's troubles. 95 years after his death, the president of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland unveiled a plaque outside his house displaying his professional and wide-ranging avocations. It's quite a long list. Oral and ophthalmic surgeon, archaeologist, ethnologist, antiquarian, biographer, statistician, naturalist, topographer, historian, folklorist. And here's the plaque here outside 1 Marion Square. I understand that the second plaque for Oscar Wilde has now been added to that house, but Sir William Robert Wills Wilde's plaque was there for a long time. And in 2016, that's just last year, a physician called Mark Walsh wrote that he must be regarded as the greatest polymath of any generation. No otologist, that's a ear person, has yet matched his contribution. He was knighted in 1864, not for his surgical practice, as you might think. After seeing and operating on his patients, he would work tirelessly on research and writing. People would come to the house to see them both, but they'd only see Lady Wilde because Sir William Wilde was always writing in his study. He had a masterful vocabulary and he wrote absolutely beautifully, just lyrically. But he was also a meticulous statistician and was asked to collect and analyze data for the medical part of the 10 yearly censuses. And, you know, we still have those 10 yearly censuses ourselves. 1841, 1851, 1861, 1871, you know, right up to the time that he died. The 1851 report on physical and mental diseases throughout Ireland is one of the greatest demographic studies of the 19th century. And for this, he was knighted in 1864. I've read quite a lot of it. It's not at all dull reading because he could create a living picture even from statistical data. And now just briefly, his life and his many accomplishments. He grew up in Roscommon. If you know Ireland at all, this is pretty much in the center of Ireland. His father was a country doctor and used to visit patients on horseback. And William, his youngest son, would accompany him and get to know the many ancient sites in Roscommon and the surrounding counties. And, you know, if you've been to Ireland, you will have seen some of these things. The dolmens, the early Neolithic tombs, and the remains of all the invasions, you know, the Vikings, the Danes, the British. The peasants were his playmates and taught him to fish and to ride on horseback and to talk in Celtic. Just conversation. I don't think he could read Celtic. He was reliant on others to help him in that respect. His father encouraged him to become a surgeon, at which he excelled, you know, obviously. He was very ill when taking his final qualifying exam as a licentiate, but passed with the highest marks. Because he loved the Irish countryside of his childhood, after establishing his house and practice in Dublin, he bought a house in Connemara for teaching Willie and Oscar how to fish and hunt. And he also built a summer house on the shores of Loch Corrib in Galway. And it was called Moytura because of a big prehistory battle which was fought there. When I went to visit it, it was owned by U2. I don't know if you know that rock group, U2. And I had to stick my camera through wire netting surrounding the house. But here's a picture. You can't see it in color, but this is the house that he built on the shores of Lake Corrib. So from Moytura, he would take his boys, again, Willie and Oscar, to search for ancient ruins and antiquities. And they also drew pictures of these sites and these antiquities for their father's books. So William Wilde's expertise led him to become an authority on prehistory. He wrote many papers and gave talks on his finds. Also, from interacting with the peasants, he collected folklore and superstitions and wrote a book on the subject called Irish Popular Superstitions, which is just absolutely a marvel to read. He also catalogued meticulously all the antiquities in the Museum of the Royal Irish Academy. A laborious, very, very time-consuming, laborious chore that others had shirked, and it took him a number of years. He also wrote 3 travel books as useful to the modern traveler as those of his own time. And if I go to Ireland again, I want to follow some of the paths that he outlined. The books were called The Beauties of the Boyne and Blackwater. The Boyne is a river, very famous river in Leinster, and it's rich in mythological, chronological, and archaeological has a rich heritage in that regard. A second book called Loch Corrib, on which he had built his house, Moytura, and a third on the artist and Irish traveler Gabriel Béranger, which Lady Wilde finished after his death. In these, he explains the historical context of the ruins and the surroundings, like the famous battles, the myths, and all the natural phenomena. He also wrote a biography of Swift. I mean, this man was so multi-talented. He countered the belief that Swift was insane by examining reports of his physical symptoms, and a Swift skull had been found in St. Patrick's Cathedral, which he examined. But he also looked at Swift's life, his relationship to his two girlfriends, Stella and Vanessa, and also did a critical analysis of Swift's verse he found in a pocketbook owned by Swift. And as you see, a very unusual accomplishment for a surgeon. But if you are a physician, if you're a scientist or a surgeon, you would say that his accomplishments as an ophthalmologist and oral surgeon was his major achievement. Right from his first year as a qualified surgeon, he had the motivation to search for the causes and cures of ear and eye diseases, therefore heretofore considered untreatable. After his degree, he studied at Moorfields Eye Hospital, which I believe still exists in London, and the General Hospital and the Josephinum Academy in Vienna, to learn as much as he possibly could from renowned specialists. He wanted all his work as a surgeon to be based on sound scientific principles, as opposed to misdiagnoses of causes and hit or miss treatments of the past. He wrote many papers on ophthalmological procedures, like directions for operating on squints and many types of cataracts. He also invented a number of instruments and procedures for examining and operating on diseases of the ears. He designed different sized and shaped specula, you can see a picture here, for examining different ears, and a snare for removing polyps is named after him, Wilde's snare. A procedure for draining pus from the middle ear through the mastoid bone, which is just right behind the ear, is called Wilde's incision. Now, had he been around when his son died from mastoiditis, he may have been able to save him. In 1853, when he was only 38 years old, he published the first textbook on oral surgery, oral meaning ear. It was used throughout Europe and America. In his introduction, he wrote, "I have labored to rescue treatment of the diseases of the ear from empiricism and quacks who exploit the poor." And you know that we are exploited all the time by all the advertisements that come at the end of our magazines to buy that will help, you know, things like ear problems. The same year, he was made surgeon oculist to Queen Victoria in Ireland. In 1844, he founded St. Mark's, the first hospital for the seeing and hearing impaired in Dublin. It also became a center for teaching and research, to which students from all over the world came to learn, because he was absolutely a marvelous teacher, and he really pushed bedside manner, so that he would go personally to take histories from patients. Patients would flock, and also patients would flock to him, and it required him moving into increasingly larger facilities, which he bought and equipped with his own money. He began in his first house that he owned, and then he moved to a stable, and then to an abandoned almshouse, and finally in 1850 to more commodious premises in the medical school where he had trained and also studied and taught. He insisted that it be kept immaculately clean. That's the mantra at the end of every experiment and every procedure that he writes about. And this is very ironic because so many people have talked about, so many irresponsible biographers talked about his dirty nails. But if you're an antiquarian, of course, you're going to be digging in dirt, you know, and getting dirt underneath your nails. He established, because there were so many patients, he established an early national health service. He began by treating the poor for free because he was a man of great compassion. But his practice soon became too expensive to sustain, so he began perhaps the first national health service where, rather than apply for public aid, patients would pay a monthly subscription of sixpence. But his personality, and you might know surgeons of this ilk, aroused jealousy. So William Wilde's tireless energy and work ethic, his dynamic personality, his refusal to tolerate fools, his incredible surgical achievements, tinged no doubt with arrogance, aroused jealousy. And after 1900, critics were just ready to pounce. In 1976, 100 years after his death, however, he was honored as one of the most remarkable savants of the 19th century, one of the most gifted eye and ear surgeons of the day, and one of the greatest Irishmen of his time. And that is Sir William and Lady Wilde.